Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The topic of today's online event is regenerative ag, on the ground versus in the books. My name is Brandy Yanchik, and I'm an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker who's based in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 territory. I'd like to acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footprints have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Nahayao, Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Ishka, Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot peoples. I also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and the home of one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. Before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time today, or you are experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. There is a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can click the thumbs up icon on the question to move it to the front of the queue. We will also have a couple of poll questions for you. Today's event will consist of the presentations by our panelists, followed by some questions after each presentation. We will then have a panel discussion around the topic. Please be aware that this event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and you will receive the link in an email along with the post-event survey. We will be taking clips from the video and posting these on social media. We do hope that today's event promotes more discussion with the broad diversity of participants. Today, I am joined by two distinguished speakers for this discussion. Tim Ray from Ray Ranch in Irricana, Alberta. Ray Ranch was awarded the 2023 Environmental Stewardship Award, and Tatenda Mombo, a postdoctoral associate at the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy. Welcome to you both. Before we begin, we have a poll question for the audience. The question is, what statement best describes your connection to farmland? My family actively farms. I have family ties to farming, but not involved. I own or inherited farmland, but I'm not managing it. I live near farmland and observe activity. Or I'm an urbanite with no personal farm connection. You will have 30 seconds to answer the poll, after which we will display the results. Okay, we have the answers. 13% of participants said my family actively farms. 16% of participants have family ties to farming but are not involved. 16% of participants own or have inherited farmland but are not managing it. 3% of participants say they live near farmland and observe activity, and 52% say they are urbanites, no personal farm connection. And the answer to the Zoom poll is, there is no correct answer. We just wanted to get to know you a little bit better. I will now invite Tim Ray to start the discussion. As you listen to his presentation, can you please think of some questions you'd like to ask Tim and put them in the Q&A box? In your question, please tell us about yourself. Tell us your name and your location and your profession.
Well, thank you. Welcome to Ray Ranch. I'm going to take you on a quick visual tour of our farm. And I'll tell you, I'm participating in this event today because I'm trying to advance regenerative agriculture. And in 14 minutes, I want to inspire in you a picture, a sense, even the smells of what farming can be. And I also want to demonstrate the pressure cooker that farmers are operating under, particularly in this unique era of farm transition. And farmland will transition. The University of Guelph recently released a study, and they concluded 40% of farmers will retire in the next 10 years. And they've been saying that for a long time, but these people are now getting to be in their 60s. It is going to happen. And so here we have a great opportunity as a society to transition those farmlands into hands of progressive, committed people that can renew landscapes and their communities. That's my thesis. And from what I saw in that poll, 45% of people on this call today have direct ties to a farm, to lands that are being used for agricultural purposes. And I happen to know that 55% of the urbanites and people just drive by and watch land, they still have a chance to invest in this movement too. And I hope by the end of this, you're just knocking on the door looking for ways. Yes, I'm going to show my slides. Thank you very much. Always got to be the awkward guy on a webinar. Doesn't show. Okay. Okay, well, there's a quick picture of Ray Ranch, and we got to fly. So that's us. Quick backstory. My primary business partner is my Uncle Doug, which is very important in farm succession. All right. The regenerative needle is advancing at the grassroots for a number of reasons. And here is what the 4 things that I'm seeing. Market forces are driving regenerative uptake. There are ideological commitments. Some people are just doing it because they want to. There are happenstance discoveries along the way, and there is agronomic brilliance that is going to advance this movement and even is. And our farm is a picture of all 4 of those things, and I'm going to show you that how we fit this mold. Okay, and we fit the mold so well that they gave us an award for basically trying hard, and I'll tell you the story here. Okay, my Uncle Doug, around the turn of the millennium, year 2000, converted about 1,000 acres of cropland in our area into perennial stands. And all these little fields, these are quarter sections that got parsed up 8 ways into 20-acre paddocks. And then he proceeded to move cattle across those lands with perennial forages and then winter annuals with a grazing program. Okay, very quick story. And what happened because of that was we had photosynthesis on the land from April through November. And if you know the frost-free period, we're frost-free within that window for maybe 110 days. So outside of the frost-free period, we still have photosynthesis. And at the same time, we also have nutrient distribution on the land, thanks to those cattle, year-round. And this system's at play, and it's moving. And it turns out that these are the very same parameters that formed the rich, dark soils of the prairie landscape. Well, how did we do this? Well, first of all, there was a market force at play. 1999, my uncle couldn't afford to grain farm anymore. It's that simple. The market affected it. But he liked cows. That's it. Cows are good. There's an ideological commitment. Cows are good. And he liked them. He could work with them. And he owned them. And he wouldn't need to finance them. So there are so many things about cows that worked for him. And after about 10, 15, 20 years, the scientists began to tell him, hey, this is actually really good for the soil. What you're doing, photosynthesizing for long periods of time and moving cattle across the landscape. If you look at this chart here, those blue lines show nitrate levels in the soil in October. And for us, that's huge. That's just tons of nutrient. It's not just loose floating around. It's bound up in biological activity, ready for next year. The purple bar, 10 pounds of available nitrates. That's what conventional cropland would be. So we're dealing with maybe 7 times more. And off to the side, we see our organic matter. When my uncle was farming back in the 80s, we might have been down around 3%. And then thanks to no-till grain farming and then this regenerative high management grazing, we've more than doubled those, bringing the soils back closer to what they were under the management of Mother Nature and the bison. And agronomic brilliance, well, we can't quite claim it, but we're seeing these amazing agronomic insights and trying to learn how to manage with that. And I'll get more, actually, I won't get into that at all. We just don't have time for it. But nature is powerful. And when you farm along with it, this regenerative movement, right, has a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of public interest. There's the opportunity to layer enterprises with eco services. Technology has brought us many new tools for measuring, monitoring, and management. We try to employ those, but also at the heart of it is very low tech because it's biologically driven. I want to make a case that there's room for the family in this. And that chunk of soil down in the bottom right of my screen allows us to directly see and benefit from the improvements that we can make under these management schemes. So why isn't everyone doing this? We won an environmental stewardship award. We've been interviewed a number of times by high-profile media people. And the question is, well, if this is so good, why isn't the whole nation aware of it and taking it on? Well, we still are dealing with an environment, both an economic and climatic environment that we have to operate within. And you can see the one field here on the left, lots of weeds. And we see the field on the right, drought-stricken, uneven. Hey, we have our challenges. Drought is very real. I came back to the farm. I was 36 years of age, 2015. And on the prairies, at least in my part of Alberta, we've been in the red for rainfall. And an index of 2, I'm telling you, is very difficult environment. 1 or 2 years in a row we can handle, but 5, 6, 7 years of dry gets very, very difficult. Okay, this slide is just a case study. I'm going to open my books and show you what we're doing as farmers. This is cow-calf operation. 2021 was a drought year. I'm going to simplify it. If we were nothing but cows and calves, we would have lost $117,000 as Ray Ranch in 2021. In fact, we didn't, because what happened in the drought, we just sold those cattle, put that money in our pocket, but we lost net wealth, net worth. In 2024, that's this coming year, if things go pretty well, under our current projections, we're going to make $20,000 on a farm, 1,700-acre farm. We stand to make $20,000. But off to the right, if it would rain, we could make over $370,000. But to generate $380,000, we need 330 more cows. And right now, cow prices are pretty good, $3,200 for small bred cow. That's just $1 million loan. 5-year payment terms, 8.1%, pretty standard in cow-calf. Okay, that's $100,000 down payment, $235 interest and principal, 340 out of 380. Are there smarter ways to make $40,000? I suspect there's people sitting here on this webinar right now, enjoying their lunch, getting paid, because they're making money way smarter than farmers like me. Would you do it? Would you put $1 million on the line to make $40,000? And why have we built a food system that asks growers to take such huge financial risks? And I happen to know some of the answers of why we do that. But it's getting to a point where I'm feeling the pinch. And I wonder if there's another way. So why are farmers smiling? This is my family, by the way. Why are we smiling? Because the farm is not so much a productive asset as it is now a storeholder of generational wealth. And the 45% of people on that survey that clicked, yeah, I'm tied to some farmland, understand this very, very well. The best risk-adjusted return on farmland comes from owning the land, not operating it. And thus my thesis, if we are to see regenerative uptake, right, in the actual practices of management, we need to address land ownership and farm transfers. So let's look at the Ray Ranch as an example. I'm going to show you some pie charts. And keep in mind, in these pie charts, Ray Ranch is top 20 percentile on cash returns per cow in our industry. All right. We're not the best, but we are exemplary. We're top 20 percentile. So what does this mean for the other 80%, right? When you see the pie charts. So please, I'm asking you, help me. Okay. Here's the annual wealth generation on a 1,700-acre ranch. This whole pie represents about $1.1 million. All right. The blue wedge is $50,000 of profits from running cows. Okay, but those cows pay the landowners on Ray Ranch about $64,000. That's the orange pie. And then the gray slice, the gray thin slice, that's just money that comes from oil and gas revenues. So that also goes to the landowners. And the yellow slice is about $880,000, which is 8% real estate equity gained by owning that farmland, which explains why so many people want to own farmland, which is why the bank will loan you money if you have farmland. And it's why succession planners with the fiduciary responsibility to their clients advise them to keep the land in the family and to allow someone else to ranch or farm it, because that yellow pie is just so secure and growth oriented year after year after year. And so when it gets distributed out, see my lower pie, same size of pie, same amount of wealth, but the way it's distributed, you have the little blue slice that goes to those who are managing the land. And then you have all of the rest going to the land owners. But where are the resources and the expertise to regenerate the landscape? It's in the whole pie. It's in the whole pie. But we dare not lose the blue slice. So what if we just shifted the pie a little bit? And I'm going to use this as an icon. I want it to symbolize something I'm calling steward ownership. And I'm saying that could be Canada's preferred goal of farm transition. We just don't know it yet. Steward ownership recognizes that a thriving steward is essential to the value proposition of a managed landscape. And this is my Aunt Linda. And the joke here is the keystone species, whether it's in Cochrane, Alberta, you got a cougar. And here's our own cat, Auntie Linda, top dog, top cat on our farm. Keystone species. We have to protect and preserve her. Okay. Back to that same pie chart, annual wealth distribution, nothing new there, $1.1 million, and there's a $50,000 slice going to the rancher. On a cash basis, just straight cash, I'll show you here again. We have land rent, dark gray, gas, oil and gas, light gray, and then the remaining slice going to the ranch, okay? 28% of cash revenues go to the cows, 100% of risk, 100% of work goes to the rancher. Okay, but what if we imagine this in a steward ownership model? Same size of pie, just changing the wedges. Okay, I'm going to walk you through a model. The blue slice represents what I'll call steward co. They manage the working assets. They receive a percentage of the surface rights. They purchase land shares. They bear the risk of operating a farm, but the slice has been slightly increased because now they're receiving a share of the land cash. Okay? Everyone is recognizing, whoa. If we want to preserve this landscape, if we want to enhance this landscape, we have to give you a little bigger slice. We're going to give up some cash. Okay. The orange slice is somebody like Trustco. It could be grandma, right? It could be an existing landowner who wishes to advance the farm transition. It could be an impact investor with conservative financial goals. It could be a trust held by a third party or a nonprofit, right? But what it is a landholder who enjoys equity growth but requires no cash return. And there are people who are willing to incur such an investment. Okay. Each of these possible investors has the ability to use their capital to advance the purpose of a landscape and still enjoy equity gains. They're just not making a cash play. Okay. And then the big pie here, Landco, are shares that do receive some land dividend. They're shares held by Steward Co., maybe a retired farmer, maybe heirs, maybe absentee investors who just aren't quite as generous as Trustco. They just need to see, a 2% return on investment or something, and they're willing to siphon a few pennies off. Okay? But each of these still has a critical role. Now, on a cash basis, we just shifted the pie, basically giving surface lease rights, and a chunk of the cash rent now goes to the steward. Why? Because we need to preserve the keystone species. And if someone said, well, would you be willing to ranch cattle for $123,000? You're still going to have to pay some bills. You're going to have to do some capital upgrades, but you're going to be able to take maybe $60,000 for your family. You'll be able to go to Disney World once or twice in your career. And you're going to know that you can secure the land base and have some cash that you can invest in the future and invest in the landscape. Would you do it? Would you do it with a little bigger piece of the pie? I'm saying there are people that will. Okay. And Landco, those kids in the city watching webinars on their lunch break are still getting a nice little kickback, enough to pay for their trip to Disneyland every year. So it's still a pretty good deal. Okay. What's the goal here? The goal is to remember, not to dismember, right? But to remember by allowing all those who desire to meaningfully participate in land stewardship to do so together. Okay, we want to remember the farm, remember the family, the community, the ecosystem, the economy. And I'm telling you, that skinny slice of the blue pie and the squeeze of the gray pie, as a farmer, feels to me like a dismemberment. So I'm looking for another way that we can institutionalize land stewards for the success of everybody. Steward ownership answers some major challenges. And those 45% who have access to farmland, listen carefully, please. Steward ownership secures and rewards the land steward. They're not getting squeezed off. They have a place. And imagine as we go through, these are pictures of Ray Ranch. And you could imagine what happens to these people, particularly those who are under the age of 70, if they have to rely on the little blue slice. And then imagine, how does that orange pie, how does the larger blue pie, just slightly larger blue pie, make more room for what you're seeing on the picture? And I'm telling you, the bigger blue pie makes more room for these land stewards. All owners enjoy gains in equity. The most valuable part of farmland from a financial perspective is shared by everybody. These are my nieces and nephews and my kids. And I'm telling you, they don't care if they get 8% or 9%. Doesn't bother them. They're just happy to be part of it. Steward ownership provides liquidity in shares. My aunt and uncle farmed this land for 45 years. They made these investments and they have a chance to reap financial reward for that with security into their retirement by garnering some liquidity. They're going to sell their farm bit by bit, slowly. It aligns capital and labor with purpose. Got Dylan in the back of a 40-year-old grain truck. You know why he's willing to work in a 40-year-old grain truck? Because in a steward ownership model, he's getting ahead. He's getting ahead. In the pie where there is no steward ownership, he's just a serf waiting for that tractor and the truck to die, and he will not be able to afford to replace them. He will be removed from the landscape. Steward ownership answers the opportunity to celebrate reinvestment. Cows require investment, and cows, uh, it's very volatile. But if you have a little bigger piece of the pie, you say, you know what, these cows are central to so many things, gross domestic product of our province, all the way down to the landscape function on Ray Ranch. And we can celebrate that we're reinvesting them year over year because we have a little bigger piece of the pie. We can celebrate that this kid, if she wants, can grow crops under her management one day because there's going to be room for her. We're going to make sure it's there. And steward ownership recognizes the layers of value and values that enrich the whole. Right? This Canada goose and her little goslings, there's room for her with the blue and the orange pie just stretched a little bit bigger. And these interested journalists and upscaling marketing people who come to our farm, there's room for them when we've got a little breathing space. We don't have a noose around our neck waiting for the bank. And this here's a fragile riparian zone. There's room in steward ownership to fence this off and make space for all that wants to habitate in there. We don't have to harvest right up to the banks. And this stewardship pie makes room for another generation on Ray Ranch. I was doing a vet in service. I gave a talk talking about Ray Ranch environmental stewardship. Shma, shma, shma. Policy idea that got the room excited. I'm talking farmer after farmer coming up, shaking my hand, say, this would solve some real problems on our farm. Something like 100% capital gains tax exemption. Okay, you can see why farmers would get excited, right? 100% capital gains exemption on farmland sold, okay? And you might roll some farm assets into that too, because it's not enough to have $10 million of farmland. You have to still have $3 million of working capital. So some farmland, there's major tax benefits as a rent to own, right? If they are willing to sell their farm on a rent to own basis, 0% interest to a tenant steward, right? This is so key. And this is how we settled the West. And okay, that was fraught with colonialism, and there's still some problems we got to work out with this. But the idea was we could build an economy by having people on a landscape. And so we want to incentivize, we want to resettle rural Saskatchewan. If we can sell farmland to a tenant steward who lives, say, within what, 5 or 10 miles of the farm, actively farms the land. It could be a farmer or indigenous group, okay, who will hold the controlling share. So they don't even have to buy the whole farm. They just have to buy the controlling share. Okay. If you will do that, we will give you massive tax benefits. And most farmers don't need to sell all $14 million of their farm. You know, 1 or 2 million would more than secure. So we could make this work with this pot. Okay. That's my big genius idea. This is a beautiful picture of what Ray Ranch looks like when it's not totally droughted out. Other potential policy considerations. I'm going to just go through this very quickly. Changing land appraisal methodologies from highest and best use. This is very important in state settlements. Help renewable diesel and plant protein sectors demonstrate and advance regenerative rigor. If we're going to grow 30% more canola, where's that canola going to be grown? I'm afraid it's going to be grown on secondary landscapes, and we need to account for and make plans to foster these high value add industries for our crops, but really make a plan about where they're going to be grown. We need land use legislation to preserve farmland. BC has done some of this. I don't know much about it, okay? Incentivize carbon neutral farms versus carbon offsets. Why not put rigor into saying agriculture is carbon neutral, period? Why do we want to make some other industry carbon neutral? Why not just make agriculture carbon neutral and then reap the reward of that rigor and integrity? What about advantaging super long-term leases? Kid, you'll never buy the farm. I'll lease it to you for 100 years. And there's some creative ideas we could do with that. income for ecosystem function. Okay, lots of talk about this. Let's figure it out. And finally, I can't see because develop friendly insurance mechanisms. Yeah, regen friendly insurance mechanisms. And hopefully someone on this 80 people watching this today has some thoughts around that. But insurance has a lot to do with the way in which people plan their production practices. And if we want to see regen adoption, we got to deal with that. Okay, that's my time. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was fascinating, and we've learned a lot and have lots to think about. The question that we have for you is, can you briefly provide some examples of successful steward ownership models in agriculture? What factors contributed to their success?
Thank you. Yeah. So, no, I don't know of some agriculture sector that's done this other than the traditional family farm. The traditional family farm has, in all its sense, traditional, has already operated in this way where people were not requiring the next generation to pay for everything. They were giving them a big advantage. But with all of these farms turning over, I'm saying we need to institutionalize that to create mechanisms so that when these succession planning groups come on board and when people are trying to deal with farm sales and whatnot, they have then some legal parameters to go about and implement this in a real way. In Europe, there are these classic stories, and the most famous, which is this company called Zeiss. They make the lens for microscopes and telescopes and all this. Anyways, the guy made billions of dollars back in the 1800s, and in the end, he said, "You know what? I'm going to turn this company over to my employees." Japan has a number of examples. The U.S. has some. Steward-owned companies last something like 200 years longer than non-steward owned companies. They just have more staying power. So I pitch that to you. Yeah, I don't want to come across as a dilettante. I'm just a farmer banging my head against the wall, and I'm trying to show you some pie charts that would make sense. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. We really appreciate it. And before we move on to our next guest speaker, we're going to do another quick poll question to our audience here. For our audience, you have 30 seconds to answer the poll. And the question is, why is the lack of shared definition for regenerative agriculture a problem? 1, it hampers communication and the assessment of impacts. 2, risks greenwashing as regenerative agriculture can be used as a buzzword. And greenwashing is when an entity misleads the public into believing they're doing more to protect the environment than they actually are. 3, hinders public action to promote regenerative agricultural practices. Or 4, all of the above. And you have 30 seconds to answer this poll question. And we have our answers. In response to the question, why is the lack of a shared definitions for regenerative agriculture a problem? We see that 8% think it hampers communication and the assessment of impacts. 3% says it risks greenwashing as regenerative agriculture can be used as a buzzword. And 89% say all of the above, which includes hinders public action to promote regenerative agricultural practices. So the answer to the Zoom poll is all of the above. 89% of you were correct. So to share further insights, I will now invite Tatenda Mombo to share his presentation and explain the definitions of regenerative agriculture in more detail. Please remember to type your questions in the Q&A box. When you ask your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession. Thank you. Just waiting for Tatenda's camera. Here we go. There you are.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you, Tim, for that presentation. I'll be touching on some of the things we talked about, but to give a good illustration of what a regenerative operation looks like on the ground. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges in settling on a definition for regen ag. And this work actually comes out of a broader project we're doing to try and develop a producer-centric definition for regen ag within Alberta. So with that said, in general, when we talk about regen ag, this is the idea people have. It's about shifting the paradigm for one where you are essentially focusing on productivity on the farm as the end result, to one where you have a more holistic perspective on how the entire farm and the farm ecosystem works. This definition here comes from Wikipedia, and within that definition, you can see there's a combination of different themes that regard things like regenerating topsoil and certain ecosystem functions that you're trying to strengthen as you grow food. But once you dive a little bit deeper than that, there are some debates within the academic literature about what exactly is regen ag. And to illustrate this, I pulled up a few definitions. Again, you'll see a few different themes. This first one here has a lot to say about different things that you see within the environment and particular outcomes you're trying to achieve. This third one here has a greater focus on community and the organization of people behind the purpose of doing regen ag. And then this last one here ties in perspectives about acknowledging and also honoring Indigenous perspectives on things such as reciprocity, respect, and care for the environment itself. So regen ag has been growing a lot since about 2016. The term originally was coined in the late 1970s, popularized by the Rodale Institute in the 1980s, and then it was kind of quiet for a very long time. But around 2016, especially within print media, terms such as regenerative agriculture and regenerative farming really just skyrocketed. And the academic literature follows suit. And as such, you have this really large tent with all these different actors. And it's quite surprising to see these different types of groups that have very different interests, all kind of in this under the same tent of regenerative agriculture. So you have groups like Cargill, which are large multinationals. You have a lot of conservation organizations, such as the Battle River Watershed Alliance, and many other smaller groups. Ground is a group that's based in South Africa, trying to achieve particular ecological outcomes. But with all this growth and all of this diversity, there are some concerns about, if we don't have a definition, it becomes very difficult to actually test the claims about certain benefits and outcomes. It becomes very difficult to engage the public with ideas of regen ag because it could lead to a misunderstanding or greenwashing, as was alluded to earlier. And also it makes it very challenging to create the right type of policy and environment to foster the growth of this sector, given how popular it actually is. So like I mentioned, this work comes out of a much larger project we've been doing, and the first stage in that was actually conducting a literature review. These are the four approaches that literature review brought up in terms of how the academic literature is classifying regen ag. So we have process-based definitions here. We have outcome-based definitions. We have what we're calling a regenerative mindset approach. And then finally, looking at social dimensions. So I'm going to go through each one of these different large, broad categories. So the process-based definitions are the most common that you come across. And it's largely focusing on particular practices that farmers engage in, or the implementation of very specific principles. I think for most people, this is how they understand regen ag. These principles are pretty common. If any of you have read Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown, these are principles that he does talk about. And there are particular practices associated with trying to implement these principles. So we're talking about things such as minimizing tillage, use of cover crops, using rotational grazing. So at its simplest form, by simply implementing these practices, you can therefore call yourself regenerative by checking these boxes. And some people claim that there are limitations to this approach because it says nothing about outcomes, and it doesn't really assess whether these practices themselves are actually linked to the particular outputs and outcomes that we want to see in the long term. Another approach instead is to look at the outcomes. And with this perspective, there is no prescription on practices. It's kind of left to the user to determine what outcomes they want to achieve and what practices help them get there. As a result, this is going to be very contextual based because your outcomes will be determined by the nature of the operation you have and what you're trying to achieve. In addition to that, it takes into account the different geographical variety that people are working within. So your soil status will be quite different from someone else's, and as a result, the practices you're going to engage in to get there will be different. But some of these common outcomes that people talk about from this perspective have to do with things like climate mitigation and adaptation, integrating systems. So here we have some images here of testing water holding capacity and the water infiltration rate. And these are some of the outcomes, particularly regarding soil that different producers might be looking at. Biodiversity and ecological outcomes are also major themes in terms of people who try to classify regen ag from this perspective. The next one here takes into account regenerative mindsets. Holistic management might be the most common or most popular approach with this approach to defining regen ag. And it's about looking at the farm as a holistic system. And this image here does a very good job at illustrating all the different concerns that producers might be trying to balance as they try to make their operations work. So the finances on the farm, the climate, all the different biological systems and how they integrate with each other to try and achieve your outcomes, and how all these things have an impact on society as a whole. One interesting approach to these more philosophical perspectives is that all things such as synthetics or different techniques are not classified as good or bad, but they're simply tools used to try and achieve your outcome. There's an unsettled question as to whether things like GMOs and whether synthetics have a place within regen ag. Some say it's a clear red line and they shouldn't be part of that process. But most people who have this perspective simply say that those are merely tools, and how you use them to achieve your outcomes is really what comes into question there. But overall, you're trying to integrate natural systems within your farm operation, functioning more from the sharing perspective rather than the sparing perspective. The social dimensions are some of the newer introductions to debates about defining regen ag. So particularly from our Western perspective, a lot of these practices are found in indigenous cultures. And as a result, there is what some would say appropriation that is taking place, where these practices are being validated and constituted into Western science approaches, and validated in that way, but not then acknowledging and honoring that they did come from indigenous cultures. And the reason why this is important is because through that colonial process, many of these traditional practices were seen as backward or not suitable for the type of agricultural production that was needed. And today, while those practices are actually being seen as being valuable, they are actually being remade in an approach that is foreign to the culture that they came from. And these images here come from an article by Sands, highlighting how within the Western approach, there tends to be a focus on the material things that you can interact with. So things like the biophysical and the social economic aspects. However, when you look at indigenous communities, there's always this area of non-material perspectives that are also part and parcel of everything. And I think it's important to highlight this because as we are going after alternative approaches for our agricultural system, these non-material aspects are fundamental to how we shape the new story about how we interact with our lands and how we want to grow food. And by merely taking those practices but not acknowledging where they come from, it really undermines efforts towards decolonization. It's almost like gaslighting. And I think that's highlighted by Sir Albert Howard, who in Western culture is viewed as the father of the organic movement. And he's famous for the indoor process of composting. But in reality, he actually learned this process from peasant farmers in India. And he had gone there to actually teach them and convert them into Western approaches to agriculture. But instead, he says that these peasant farmers were his best teachers. And but there is little credit given to the cultures where these practices actually came from. I think Tim talked very well about this in his talk, and the social dynamics of farming, especially when it comes to the pressures that farmers are under. As much as Regen Ag can help address practices on the ground, it doesn't do anything to address pressures farmers face regarding the financialization of farmland, the reproduction of the next generation of farmers. We have an instance where farmers are being squeezed, especially their margins relative to the price of land. But everyone else in the sector around them is doing pretty well. When you look at things like machinery companies and seed companies and the different biotech companies related to agriculture. But some authors argue that there needs to be a much broader perspective on how we are defining Regen Ag to have downstream changes to how the system works if it's going to be regenerative. As some would argue, simply taking regeneratively produced products and put them into an extractive system, the system remains extractive. And what tends to happen is the parts of that system that mesh well with capitalism will be adopted, and everything else kind of falls by the wayside. So this is the full representation of all the work we've done so far in terms of these different approaches regarding Regen Ag. These lines on the sides here show that these, from going from the process base to the outcomes base, is more of a simple process to more measurable outcomes. And here, this is more of an individual approach down to a societal approach. So based on all this work, we would say that regen ag is kind of like a buffet lunch where you come in, you kind of take what you want. As such, there is no one regenerative agriculture. There's many iterations of it, and people kind of pick and choose how that works for them. There's a lot of convergence on things like the soil and certain environmental outcomes, but there's lots of divergence, like I mentioned, on things like GMOs and things such as tillage. And it's not very helpful when you have words like minimize, because it makes it sometimes difficult to know where the demarcations between regen and conventional is from that perspective. Most of the definitions so far have a big focus on the ecological, but not as much on the socio, as Tim has clearly expressed in his previous talk. And lastly, there's a lack of engagement with the political process. Other agricultural movements, such as agroecology, have political action embedded within them. And some authors argue that it's a bit naive to try and create this transformative change regarding regen ag without willing to engage in politics and that political process. When it comes to righting social inequalities, there's also concerns that some producers may not have the latitude or the interest in trying to solve social inequality, and maybe a distraction from the operations on their farm. But I think this is something that needs to be debated as we go forward. And as a result, there's concerns around greenwashing. If we don't have an idea what this term actually means, then the question becomes, will it be co-opted? If you remember the 1970s, we had the natural food movement. And I mean, it eventually fell by the wayside because that term ended up meaning nothing. That was concrete. So some of the concerns regarding this, concerns about greenwashing have to do with regen being relegated to just a set of principles and ignoring the transformative change and power that it actually has. So things such as food democracy, and especially honoring and giving credit to those indigenous perspectives. Another concern is if it's institutionalized. Again, another concern, especially with corporate investments in regen ag, authors such as Loring are concerned that these corporate investments are merely a stripping away of the social aspects of agroecology into what they now call corporate regenerative agriculture. And lastly, this idea that you have actors who are able to embrace the language, but not actually have to change their practices. So companies such as Syngenta have perspectives on regen ag. And because the idea as to whether synthetics are part of regen ag or not, because that debate is not settled, they can continue doing what they're doing regardless of the environmental impact this stuff is having on ecosystems. My last slide will be about the role of government. And there clearly is room for governments to be involved in this because of the need to create a social transition, not only regarding the ecological outcomes, but all of the stuff regarding the social situations that farmers find themselves in terms of their well-being, in terms of the ability for the next generation to take over. But the government can actually play a pivotal role in fostering adoption. There's many lessons that can be learned from agroecology in the global South and what role government has played in that. And finally, government can really provide a space to resolve some of these debates, especially when it comes to issues behind reconciliation, decolonization, and actually providing access to minorities. But the important factor here is how government does the process. So it's not a matter of them doing it, but the process they actually use to actually achieve some of these outcomes. I will stop here and open up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tatenda, for sharing your knowledge with us. And I love the analogy of the buffet. Now my mind is even thinking, how am I going to figure out that definition with all these different points? There's so much to take away from your presentation. Thank you. We're going to move to the panel discussion because we're running short on time here. I want to thank you very much for that great discussion. And please remember everyone to put your questions in the chat. Tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession. I do have one question here for Tim. And the first question is, do you believe that the contrast between conventional farming and regenerative agriculture is helpful? How do other farmers react to hearing what's being done at Ray Ranch?
Very interesting couple components of that question. But in my immediate neighborhood, when we won this award, our immediate neighbors have been watching us do this for years, and it was kind of like a pat on the back. Hey, way to go, kid. Glad you got something, because they know that we have watched our neighbors buy bigger tractors and condos in Hawaii. Well, we've been plodding away, moving cows around. So it was like a pat on the back, but that's it. Nobody in our neighborhood wants to be like us. So I'm just trying to be honest with you. This is a challenge for uptake. Okay. And then the first part of the question was, is it helpful to have this difference between conventional and regenerative? And I think Tatenda's presentation pointed out, we're still trying to work that out. I think when we say we will pay more for healthy food, then the only way to grow healthy food is to find ways to partner with nature. So if that's what you want, that's what you'll pay for.
And another question here for both of you, but Tatenda, we'll start with you. Is regenerative agriculture equipped to meet the food demands of the growing global population? What do you think?
I think it can. I think it's a question of maybe the diversity and the level of convenience we've had may not be there. If it's a question of can we feed everyone? Yes, you definitely can. But there's a lot of waste in our current system. But the short answer is yes.
What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, what is it? Like half of our food goes to waste. So for sure we can deal with that. For the first time ever, I heard through a newspaper article, a UN study said that by the end of next century, we might have half as many people on the earth. So that's something I'd never heard before. But maybe this is a false concern. If we have decreasing populations in India, China, Canada, okay. Maybe we don't need to go crazy burning the bank to feed everybody. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. But no, I think we can produce healthy, nutrient-dense food, and that's more valuable than copious amounts of poor calorie food.
Okay, another question here. This is from Michelle Nudding from Nutrient. Michelle asked, the recent roadmap from AFO on transforming food system has called out the need to break down entrenched binaries in the agri-food system to address the challenges. Entrenched binaries like animal versus plant protein, organic versus non-organic, GMO versus non-organic. How do you see the need to break through the binaries? Who wants to take this one on?
Yes, right. What's the goal, right? The goal is healthy food, healthy landscapes, healthy communities. For me, regenerative is a posture. It's a way in which we approach a thing, right? The I thou relationship that Martin Buber talks about, right? It's not a I it, right? And I thou breaks down the binaries. And I know that sounds all airy fairy and crazy, but we're stuck in a mindset that cannot accept the complexities of the world. And we have to, yes, break down the binaries so that we can move ahead as communities.
What do you think, Tatenda? Do you want to put your 2 cents in on this one?
No, that's too big a question to answer.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you, both Tim and Tatenda, for sharing your knowledge with us today. To our participants, you will receive a post-event survey and a registration link for the next online panel discussion on April 17th about food costs and farming. We'll look at fluctuating costs that are affecting agricultural businesses and the price of food. Please also go to the simpsoncenter.ca website and subscribe to hear more about upcoming events and receive our monthly newsletter for information based on research about Canadian food production. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we've had such a great discussion. Thank you.